A Chinese bugle screams in the darkness. Then another. Then 1,000. 22-year-old Marine rifleman James Ransone hears them coming through the snow at -30 degrees. Just 3 months ago, he was stationed in California. He thought World War II was the last war. He was wrong. It's late November 1950, and somewhere in the frozen mountains of North Korea, Ransone is about to fight in a war most people will never remember. A war that killed 5 million human beings. A war that brought the world to the brink of nuclear catastrophe. A war where MiG-15 seconds and F-86 Sabres dueled at 700 miles per hour, while soldiers below fought with bayonets in trenches that looked like 1917. This is the Korean War, and you've probably never heard the full story. Between June 1950 and July 1953, 22 nations sent their sons to fight on a peninsula most couldn't find on a map. A 5-star general threatened to use atomic weapons and got fired for it. China and America collided in battles that would reshape the Cold War. And when it finally ended, nobody won, and everybody claimed they did. This is the war the world forgot. But it never ended. 2 American officers sit in a small room in Washington with a National Geographic map of Korea spread across the table. It's August 1945. They have 30 minutes to divide a country they've never visited. Colonel Dean Rusk and Colonel Charles Bonesteel pick up a grease pencil. They need to find a line that splits Korea roughly in half, north for the Soviets, south for the Americans. The 38th parallel catches their eye. It runs right across the middle. Simple, clean, temporary. Nobody thinks it'll last. Japan's 35-year occupation of Korea ends with the atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Soviet forces, already advancing through Manchuria, land in northern Korea in mid-August. American forces occupy Japan starting in September. Both superpowers agree, divide Korea along that line Rusk and Bonesteel drew. The Soviets take the north, the Americans take the south. Just until they figure out what to do with the peninsula. The Korean people get no vote. For Koreans, liberation from Japan should mean freedom. Instead, it means new occupiers. Soviet soldiers in the north, American soldiers in the south. And that line, the 38th parallel, cutting straight through villages, through farms, through families. In one village near the parallel, a house sits exactly on the line. The kitchen is in the south. The bedroom is in the north. The family jokes about it at first. By 1948, they've stopped laughing. The line was supposed to disappear in 6 months. Both sides promised to work together on Korean independence. But as 1946 turns to 47 and 47 turns to 48, the Cold War freezes that temporary line into something permanent. August 1948, the Republic of Korea is announced in Seoul. Its president, 73-year-old Syngman Rhee, who spent decades in American exile fighting for Korean independence. He's fiercely anti-communist, fiercely nationalist, and absolutely convinced the entire peninsula belongs to him. September 1948, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is announced in Pyongyang. Its premier, 36-year-old Kim Il-sung, who fought Japanese occupation as a guerrilla commander and rose to the rank of major in the Soviet army. He's a true believer in communism, a Stalin loyalist, and absolutely convinced the entire peninsula belongs to him. Two governments, two ideologies, one peninsula, zero compromise. Both Koreas claim sovereignty over the entire country. Neither recognizes the other's right to exist. Neither rules out using force to reunify Korea. The question isn't whether they'll fight. It's when. Soviet forces withdraw from North Korea in December 1948. American forces withdraw from South Korea by June 1949. They leave behind two Korean governments glaring at each other across that line drawn with a grease pencil 4 years earlier. That temporary line is still there 70 years later. But in 1948, nobody's thinking about 70 years. They're thinking about right now. And right now, Koreans on both sides of that line are already killing each other. June 1949, a firefight erupts on the 38th parallel. 20 men dead by sunrise. It doesn't make international news. Neither does the next one, or the one after that. This is the war before the war. Between 1948 and 1950, the 38th parallel becomes a combat zone. Not full-scale war, but not peace either. Border raids, ambushes, skirmishes between police units and small military detachments. Sometimes it's a dozen men, sometimes it's 100. But people are dying. In the south, Kim Il-sung directs an insurgency. Communist guerrillas operate in the mountains. They attack police stations, assassinate local officials, raid villages for supplies. Syngman Rhee responds with brutal crackdowns. Mass arrests. Executions. Entire villages suspected of harbouring communists burned to the ground. Along the parallel itself, both sides launch raids across the line. South Korean forces are actually more aggressive initially. They have the advantage, better trained, better equipped by the Americans. North Korean border posts get hit repeatedly. Rhee makes no apologies. In a radio address, his voice crackles with defiance. We are responsible for the protection of the lives and property of our people. When the Korean communists come over the 38th parallel and destroy us, we cannot sit still and allow them to harm us without resistance. It's retaliation, Rhee insists. Always retaliation, never aggression. In Washington, Korea barely registers. Europe is the priority, the Berlin airlift, NATO, the Marshall Plan. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of American forces in the Far East, receives vague instructions about Korea and not much else. Some officials quietly worry about Syngman Rhee's authoritarian tendencies. His democracy looks suspiciously like a dictatorship. But he's anti-communist, and in 1949, that's what matters. The world isn't paying attention to Korea. Two Korean governments are preparing for war. Border villages are burning. Hundreds are dying in skirmishes and raids, and the international community barely notices. In Washington, Korea is a minor problem on the periphery. In Moscow, it's a potential opportunity. And in Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung is making plans. Early 1950, Kim Il-sung sits across from Joseph Stalin in Moscow. It's not their first meeting about invading South Korea. It won't be their last. Kim wants permission to attack. Stalin says no. The Soviet dictator is focused on Europe, the prize that really matters. Korea is a sideshow. Stalin sends equipment, including T-34 tanks, the proven workhorses of the Eastern Front. He sends advisors, but he refuses to commit to war. And he makes it absolutely clear the Soviet Union will not intervene directly if things go wrong. Kim Il-sung leaves frustrated. But he doesn't give up. Months later, there's a party at the Soviet embassy in Pyongyang. Kim Il-sung drinks vodka with Soviet ambassador Terentij Shtaikov. As the night wears on and the bottle empties, Kim starts talking. Shtaikov later reports the conversation to Moscow. Kim Il-sung said he cannot start the attack on his own because he is a disciplined communist, and Comrade Stalin's instructions are the law to him. Kim said if he cannot meet Comrade Stalin now, he intends to see Mao Zedong. Kim Il-sung was a bit drunk after the party and spoke in an excited fashion, but it was not accidental that he began the conversation. The threat is clear. Help me, or I'll ask China. And China is more receptive. Mao Zedong's communist forces just won the Chinese Civil War in October 1949. The People's Republic of China is barely 6 months old. But Mao remembers that thousands of Koreans fought alongside his communist forces against the nationalists. These are battle-hardened veterans, guerrilla fighters, infantry, even some officers. In early 1950, Mao releases them to Kim Il-sung. 28,000 Korean veterans of the Chinese Civil War cross into North Korea. They bring combat experience, tactical knowledge, and most importantly, they've already won a war against American-backed forces. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists had American weapons, American advisors, American money. Mao beat them anyway. Kim now has an army of proven winners. He goes back to Stalin with a promise. The campaign will be quick. The South Korean army is weak, unpopular, poorly trained. Ri's government is despised by many South Koreans. One strong push and the whole rotten structure will collapse. Victory in weeks, maybe days. January 1950, Stalin finally says yes. But he attaches conditions. The Soviet Union will provide equipment, training, and planning assistance. But no Soviet soldiers will fight. If the Americans intervene, Kim is on his own. This is Korea's war, not Moscow's. Stalin's calculation is simple. He believes the United States won't intervene. Korea is too remote, too unimportant, too far from American strategic interests. Secretary of State Dean Acheson publicly declared in January 1950 that Korea lies outside America's defensive perimeter in Asia. To Stalin, that sounds like an invitation. What Stalin doesn't know, just 3 months later, in April 1950, the US National Security Council approves NSC 68, a top-secret policy document that commits America to rolling back communist aggression anywhere in the world. The game has changed. Stalin doesn't know it yet. By June 1950, the Korean People's Army is ready. 223,000 troops, including 100,000 border police, who'll be folded into the invasion force. 150 T-34 85 tanks, proven Soviet armor that crushed the Wehrmacht. 132 aircraft, mostly older Soviet models, but more than enough for a South Korean air force that barely exists. Roughly half the invasion force consists of those Korean veterans from the Chinese Civil War, men who know how to fight, how to win, and how to defeat American-equipped armies. Across the parallel, the Republic of Korea Army has 87,500 troops. Only 35,000 are positioned along the border. They have no tanks, no air force worth mentioning, few anti-tank weapons. On paper, it's not even close. In reality, it's about to be a massacre. 4 o'clock in the morning, June 25, 1950. Rain hammers down on the 38th parallel. Through the darkness, artillery fire rips the air apart. The Korean People's Army crosses the line. North Korea will later claim they're responding to a South Korean invasion, that Ri's forces attacked first, and this is self-defense. The evidence says otherwise. This is a carefully planned, coordinated offensive using artillery, armor, and infantry in combined arms tactics that look exactly like Soviet doctrine. Because that's exactly what it is. The T-34 tanks lead the way. 70mm frontal armor that Republic of Korea forces have no way to penetrate. They're essentially invulnerable to anything the South Koreans can throw at them. Infantry follows behind the steel wave, protected by the armor, exploiting the breakthrough. Korea's narrow geography forces the invasion into 3 main axes, 3 roads south, 3 armored spearheads, all aimed at Seoul, is less than Hashon. 0 hash is greater than. The capital is only 30 miles from the parallel. In tank country, that's nothing. The only serious resistance develops near Chuncheon and along the approaches to Seoul. Republic of Korea 2nd Division tries to counterattack with the 7th Division. The attack fails. Coordination breaks down. Units get separated. T-34 seconds punch through defensive positions like they're made of paper. By June 28, Seoul's defense collapses. Syngman Rhee evacuates the capital, fleeing south with his government. Republic of Korea Army units retreat in chaos. For some South Koreans watching the invasion, the emotions are complicated. A South Korean civilian later remembers those first days. The soldiers were speaking in their hard northern accent, but to us, they were compatriots who spoke the same language, had the same customs, and had Korean blood in their veins. They seemed like long-lost brothers who had finally come home from some faraway place. Seeing them talk quietly and laugh, no one was frightened. Reunification, even at gunpoint, looks to some like liberation. That feeling won't last. The Han River cuts through Seoul, a natural defensive barrier if you can hold the bridges. Republic of Korea engineers make a catastrophic decision: blow the bridges early to stop the North Korean advance. The problem, they blow them too early. 44,000 Republic of Korea troops are still north of the river when the bridges go down. Trapped. Cut off. Most will be killed or captured. The Republic of Korea Army disintegrates. By July 30, only 22,000 troops can be accounted for, out of 87,000 just 5 weeks earlier. 2/3 of the army gone. In 5 weeks, North Korea has essentially won the war. Seoul has fallen. The South Korean military has collapsed. Syngman Rhee's government is running for its life. The Korean People's Army controls everything north of a line roughly 50 miles south of Seoul. Kim Il-sung's promise to Stalin, quick victory, total collapse, seems to be coming true. There's just one problem. Nobody asked the United States. And President Harry Truman is about to make a decision that will turn this Korean Civil War into the first hot conflict of the Cold War. June 25, 1950, the phone rings in Independence, Missouri. President Harry Truman is home for the weekend when he gets the news. North Korea has invaded the South. Truman flies back to Washington immediately. By the time he lands, his administration is already divided on what to do. Some advisors urge caution. Korea is far away, strategically marginal, potentially a Soviet trap. Others see it differently. If America doesn't respond, every communist regime in the world will think they can invade their neighbors without consequence. Truman makes his decision fast. But his first move surprises everyone, because it's not about Korea at all. June 27, Truman orders the US 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Straits. The fleet positions itself between mainland China and the island of Taiwan, where Chiang Kai-shek's defeated nationalist government has fled after losing the Chinese Civil War. The message is clear. Whatever happens in Korea, Communist China will not be invading Taiwan. Truman fears Korea might be a diversion, the opening move in a coordinated communist offensive across Asia. Take Korea, then Taiwan, then who knows what else. So, he moves to block what he thinks might be coming next. In Beijing, Mao Zedong is furious. The People's Liberation Army was almost certainly preparing to invade Taiwan and finish what the Civil War started. Now American warships sit in the strait, and the risk is too high. From China's perspective, this isn't defense, it's American intervention in China's internal affairs. The seeds of future confrontation are planted right here. But Truman isn't done. He takes the Korean crisis to the United Nations. June 27. The UN Security Council votes on a resolution to provide armed assistance to South Korea. It passes. The reason it passes reveals one of history's great diplomatic blunders. The Soviet Union isn't at the vote. Since January 1950, the Soviets have been boycotting the Security Council in protest over the UN's refusal to recognize Communist China and give Beijing the Chinese seat, still held by the nationalists in Taiwan. It's a principled stand. It's also a catastrophic mistake. If Soviet Ambassador Yakov Malik had been in his seat, he could have vetoed the resolution with one word. The Korean War might have remained a regional conflict. Instead, the resolution passes, and now it's not just an American intervention, it's a United Nations operation. Countries line up to contribute. Britain sends troops. So does Canada, Australia, New Zealand. But the coalition goes far beyond the usual suspects. Ethiopia sends a battalion. Colombia sends troops. Luxembourg sends a company. Eventually, 22 nations will contribute forces or medical support. Turkey is particularly eager. The Turks are worried about Soviet pressure on their borders and see Korea as a chance to prove their worth to the West. A Turkish soldier later explains, "While we fight here together with the UN troops, we feel that we are defending our own country. Some people in our country ask us why we have been fighting here. Our answer is as such. The communist threat is worldwide. In order to crush this threat, we have to fulfill our duty. Some American commanders privately worry that these Allied contingents, many arriving without proper equipment, adequate training, or logistical support, might become more burden than help. But they provide something crucial: international legitimacy. This isn't just America playing world police. This is the United Nations responding to aggression. There's just one problem. International forces will take weeks to arrive. And right now, South Korea is losing. Fast. General Douglas MacArthur, now 70 years old, commander of US forces in the Far East, hero of the Pacific War, takes command of all UN forces. He orders American troops from occupation duty in Japan to rush to Korea. They're about to learn that occupation duty and combat readiness are two very different things. July 5, 1950, near the town of Osan, about 30 miles south of Seoul. A small American force digs into positions along the road. 440 men from the 24th Infantry Division, 2 understrength rifle companies, a few mortars, 6 howitzers. They call themselves Task Force Smith, named after their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Smith. Their mission: delay the North Korean advance long enough for more American troops to arrive and establish a proper defensive line. The men are confident. They're Americans. They beat the Japanese. They beat the Germans. How hard can a North Korean army be? They're about to find out. Dawn breaks through the rain. Then someone hears it, a sound like metal thunder rolling toward them. T-34 tanks. 8 of them in column, infantry following behind. Task Force Smith opens fire. Artillery rounds hit the tanks. Nothing happens. The tanks keep coming. Bazooka teams rush forward with their M9A1 bazookas, the weapon that's supposed to stop tanks. They fire at point-blank range. The rounds bounce off. The M9A1 bazooka was adequate against light Japanese tanks in World War II. Against the T-34's sloped armour, it's useless. The North Korean tankers don't even slow down. They roll right through the American position, machine guns blazing, crushing equipment, scattering soldiers. More tanks appear, then more. Eventually, 33 T-34 seconds pass through Task Force Smith's position. The Americans hit them with everything: rifles, machine guns, mortars, artillery, bazookas. They claim to knock out 2 tanks. Maybe. The rest keep rolling south toward Pusan. Behind the tanks comes the infantry. Thousands of Korean People's Army soldiers, disciplined, experienced, advancing in tactical formations. Task Force Smith holds for a few hours. Then the position becomes untenable. Colonel Smith orders a withdrawal. The withdrawal becomes a rout. Men scatter into the hills. Some make it back to American lines. Some don't. Task Force Smith loses about 150 men killed, wounded, or missing, roughly 1/3 of its strength, in 5 hours of fighting. It's America's first ground combat of the Korean War. It's a disaster. The problem isn't courage. American soldiers fought hard at Osan. The problem is readiness. After World War II ended, The US military demobilized faster than any military in history. In 1945, the US Army had 89 divisions. By 1950, 10 divisions, most under strength. The troops stationed in Japan have been living soft. Occupation duty means comfortable barracks, regular hours, maybe a Japanese girlfriend, and weekend trips to Tokyo. Training is sporadic. Equipment maintenance is poor. Many units are missing key weapons and personnel. And they're designed to fight World War II's way, with massive artillery support, tank battalions, engineer units, supply trains, all the supporting elements that make American firepower doctrine work. In Korea, those elements don't exist yet. It's just infantry, with light weapons facing battle-hardened troops with armor support. Late July, the North Koreans pushed the 24th Infantry Division out of Daejeon after fierce urban combat. An American soldier remembers the day the tanks came to his position. As daylight broke, we heard this loud clanking noise. We understood now what was happening. Their tanks were coming. The tanks continued to roll down the road towards us. We had no way of stopping them. The new regimental commander, Colonel Martin, tries to stop one tank with a bazooka. The tank fires back. Direct hit. Colonel Martin is killed instantly. American forces do have one advantage: air power. F-51 Mustangs and F-80 Shooting Stars strafe North Korean columns, drop napalm, provide close air support. But without forward air controllers, trained men on the ground who can direct strikes precisely, air power's effectiveness is limited. Pilots can't always tell friend from enemy. Targets are fleeting, and the North Koreans quickly learn to move at night and hide during the day. Even the newly arrived 1st Cavalry Division, despite its name, it's mostly infantry, can't hold the line. The division gets mauled in its first engagements. In 17 days of fighting, the 24th Division loses 30% of its strength. US forces frequently outnumber the North Korean spearheads they're facing. But numbers don't matter when the enemy has tanks you can't kill, when your supporting units are still in Japan, when your troops are trained for occupation duty instead of combat. Finally, the US rushes the new 3.5-inch Super Bazooka to Korea. This one can penetrate T-34 armor, but by the time it arrives in significant numbers, the damage is done. American forces are in full retreat toward the southeast corner of the peninsula. By early August, one thing is clear: the best army in the world just got a bloody nose from a country most Americans couldn't find on a map 3 weeks ago. Late July 1950. The roads heading south are clogged with refugees. Hundreds of thousands of South Korean civilians fleeing the war. Old men carrying bundles on their backs. Women with children. Entire families pushing carts loaded with everything they own. They're caught between two armies, and neither army trusts them. American intelligence reports warn that North Korean soldiers are infiltrating south disguised as refugees. The reports are sometimes accurate. North Korean forces do use this tactic. But the fear spreads faster than the facts. Soon, every refugee column looks like a potential threat. UN aircraft start strafing refugee groups on the roads. Pilots receive orders to attack people in white clothing being standard for Korean civilians. Bombs fall on crowds of families. Machine gun fire rips through carts and belongings. The refugees have nowhere to hide. July 25 through 29, 1950, near the village of No-Gun-ri, a large group of South Korean refugees, estimates range from several hundred to over 1,000 people, approaches a railroad bridge where American troops from the 7th Cavalry Regiment have set up a blocking position. The Americans order the refugees to stop and be searched for weapons and infiltrators. What happens next will be disputed for decades. According to refugee survivors, American soldiers force them under the bridge, then open fire with machine guns and rifles for 3 days. Bodies pile up in the confined space. People use corpses as shields. Children scream until they die. US estimates suggest up to 400 South Korean civilians are killed at No-Gun-ri. In 1999, nearly 50 years later, South Korea launches an investigation. They claim to find evidence that US officers gave explicit orders to fire on refugee columns, citing US military reports from July 1950 that discuss blocking and neutralizing refugees in areas where infiltration was suspected. The official US investigation in 2001 reaches a different conclusion. No written orders to fire on civilians were found. The report acknowledges that refugees were killed by US forces at No-Gun-ri, but describes it as a tragic result of confused, frightened soldiers in combat conditions, not a deliberate massacre. The truth probably lies somewhere in the fog of war. Some North Korean infiltrators did hide among refugees. American troops were terrified of being overrun. Command failures left soldiers without clear rules of engagement. And in that chaos, hundreds of innocent people died. No-Gun-ri wasn't the only place where refugees died. It's just the one that became known. Along every road south that summer, civilians paid the price for two armies fighting over their country. This is what happens when the line between soldier and civilian, between friend and enemy, disappears in the smoke and confusion of retreat. August 1950, American and South Korean forces are squeezed into a rectangular perimeter in the southeast corner of Korea. The Naktong River forms the western edge. Mountains and the sea bound the other sides. It's called the Pusan Perimeter, named after the port city at its southern tip. This box, roughly 50 miles by 100 miles, is all that remains of the Republic of Korea. If the perimeter breaks, the UN forces will be pushed into the sea. There's nowhere left to retreat. Pusan is the last stand. But the situation is starting to change. Reinforcements pour into Pusan port daily. The British 27 Brigade arrives with Centurion tanks and experienced infantry. More American divisions land, the 2nd Infantry Division, the 1st Marine Division. Equipment flows in, M26 Pershing heavy tanks that can finally match the T-34 artillery, ammunition, supplies. By late August, UN forces organized under the US 8th Army have a 5-to-1 advantage in armor. American tanks now outnumber North Korean tanks by a huge margin, and the Pershings can kill T-34 seconds at range. The playing field has leveled. In the air, UN superiority is total. The North Korean Air Force barely exists anymore. American F-51 Mustangs, F-80 Shooting Stars, and B-29 Superfortress bombers dominate the skies. They hit North Korean supply lines, troop concentrations, and any armor they can find. Napalm turns roads into infernos. The Korean People's Army keeps attacking the perimeter throughout August and early September. They launch 13 major assaults, trying to break through at different points, testing the line, looking for weakness. Some attacks penetrate several miles before being thrown back. The fighting is brutal, close range, often hand-to-hand in the August heat. But the North Koreans are exhausted. They've been fighting continuously since June 25. Over 2 months of offensive operations with limited rest, stretched supply lines, and mounting casualties. The divisions that smashed through South Korean defences in June are worn down to shadows of their former strength. September 12, 1950, the Korean People's Army's final major assault on the Pusan perimeter burns out. They've thrown everything at the line. Nothing breaks through. The offensive is over. In the occupied cities to the north, the initial enthusiasm some South Koreans felt for reunification has curdled into terror. A Seoul resident remembers the change. In the beginning, it was an atmosphere of unrestrained joy, of true liberation. Long live the fatherland. We still did not realize that this was a catastrophe for us. In the days that followed, we heard that the communists were rounding up reactionaries. Slowly, the atmosphere of terror set in. North Korean political officers compile lists. Former officials, police officers, landowners, teachers, anyone suspected of opposing communism. They're arrested in the night, taken away. Many never return. By September 1950, the United Nations estimates that northern forces have murdered approximately 26,000 South Korean civilians in occupied territories. Mass graves are discovered later. Bodies in wells. Execution sites in the hills outside cities. Political violence flows both ways. South Korean forces and right-wing groups execute suspected communist sympathizers as they retreat south, then again as they advance north. The war has become a settling of scores, a revolution and counter-revolution playing out in blood. But for now, in mid-September 1950, the immediate question is military. The Pusan perimeter has held. The North Korean offensive has stalled. UN forces are building strength. And far to the north, General Douglas MacArthur is planning something audacious, an amphibious landing that every expert says is impossible. MacArthur is going to do it anyway. Early September 1950, General Douglas MacArthur stands in his headquarters in Tokyo, studying maps of the western Korean coast. His staff is arguing. The Navy is skeptical. The Marines are cautious. Everyone has concerns about the same place, Incheon. Incheon is the port city serving Seoul, about 20 miles inland from the Yellow Sea. An amphibious landing there would put UN forces deep behind North Korean lines, cut their supply routes, and threaten Seoul itself. On paper, it's brilliant. In practice, it's a nightmare. The problems with Incheon are almost comical in their severity. First, the tides. Incheon has one of the highest tidal ranges in the world, 32 feet between high and low tide. That means twice a day, the harbour empties out into vast mudflats where landing craft would simply stick in the mud, helpless targets for anyone with a rifle. The landing can only happen during high tide. There are only 2 days in September when the tide is high enough, September 15 and September 27. Miss those windows, and you wait another month. And on those days, You have exactly 3 hours to get thousands of men ashore before the water disappears again. Second, the approach. Ships have to navigate a narrow, winding channel called Flying Fish Channel to reach Incheon. The channel is so tight that if one ship gets hit and sinks, it blocks the entire invasion fleet. Naval commanders hate it. Third, the landing beaches aren't beaches at all. They're sea walls, concrete and stone walls ranging from 12 to 16 feet high that Marines will have to scale under fire using ladders. There's no cover, no concealment, just vertical walls and whatever the enemy puts on top of them. Naval commanders present these problems to MacArthur and essentially tell him Incheon is impossible. MacArthur listens to every objection. Then he delivers one of his trademark performances, part military analysis, part theatrical speech. The very arguments you make as to the impracticabilities involved will tend to ensure for me the element of surprise, MacArthur says. The enemy commander will reason that no one would be so brash as to make such an attempt. Surprise is the most vital element for success in modern war. If we strike at Incheon, we shall land at the heart of the enemy's supply line. Then he uses a metaphor that becomes famous. It will be like an electric fan. You go to the wall and pull the plug out, and the fan will stop. When we get well ashore at Incheon, the North Koreans will have no choice but to pull out or surrender. MacArthur gets his landing. X-Corps is formed, a new command under Lieutenant General Edward Almond, one of MacArthur's most loyal subordinates. The 1st Marine Division will lead the assault. The 7th Infantry Division will follow, over 70,000 men total. September 15, 1950. Dawn breaks over Incheon. The first target is Wolmi-do, a small fortified island connected to Incheon by a causeway. If the North Koreans control Wolmi-do, they can fire directly into the main landing beaches. It has to be taken first. 6:33 a.m. The morning tide reaches its peak. Marines from the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, hit the beach at Wolmi-do. Naval gunfire has been pounding the island for hours. Aircraft drop napalm and rockets. The island is burning. The Marines storm ashore, expecting heavy resistance. They get some North Korean defenders fight from bunkers and trenches, but nothing like what everyone feared. Within 45 minutes, the American flag is flying on Wolmi-do's highest point. By mid-morning, the island is secured. Now comes the hard part, waiting for the evening tide. The Marines on Wolmi-do are stuck on that island for the next 8 hours while the water drains away, leaving miles of mud between them and the main force. If the North Koreans counterattack in strength, those Marines are isolated and vulnerable. But no major counterattack comes. 5:30 p.m. The evening tide rolls in. Now the main assault begins. 2 landing beaches, Red Beach to the north, Blue Beach to the south. Marines hit both simultaneously as the sun sets over Incheon. At Red Beach, the seawall looms above the landing craft. Marines scramble up ladders under machine gun fire. Some ladders break. Some Marines fall back into the water. But they keep climbing, and once they're over the wall, they're into Incheon's streets, urban combat, house to house, room to room. At Blue Beach, the Marines face similar challenges but encounter lighter resistance. North Korean defenders are present, but not in the numbers everyone expected. Some positions fight hard. Others surrender quickly. By midnight, both beaches are secure. By the end of September 15, X-Corps controls most of Incheon. American casualties are surprisingly light, fewer than 200 killed and wounded in the initial landing. The impossible landing has succeeded. Why did it work? The North Koreans almost certainly knew an amphibious landing was coming somewhere. Their intelligence wasn't that bad. But they probably thought Incheon was too difficult, too risky. They guessed the Americans would land somewhere easier. MacArthur's calculation that the very difficulty of Incheon would guarantee surprise turned out to be exactly right. And the North Koreans had another problem. They didn't have enough troops to defend everywhere. Most of their army was at the Pusan perimeter, 200 miles south, fully committed to the offensive there. They couldn't be in two places at once. Now MacArthur springs the trap. X-Corps pushes inland towards Seoul, while simultaneously, 200 miles south, the 8th Army breaks out of the Pusan perimeter and drives north. The North Korean army is caught in a vice. The electric fan's plug has been pulled. September 25, 1950, American troops fight their way into Seoul. The capital has changed hands twice already, first when North Korea took it in June, now as UN forces retake it in September. The street fighting is brutal. Buildings burn. Civilians hide in basements. The city that both Koreas claimed as their capital is being destroyed in the fight to possess it. Behind the lines, the Korean People's Army is collapsing. Caught between X-Corps driving east from Incheon and 8th Army driving north from Pusan, North Korean units disintegrate. Some try to fight their way out. Some surrender. Many just scatter into the mountains, abandoning equipment, stripping off uniforms, trying to blend in with refugees heading north. The army that conquered most of South Korea in 2 months is destroyed in 2 weeks. Of the Korean People's Army units that invaded in June, only about 25,000 soldiers make it back across the 38th parallel in organized formations. The rest, over 150,000 men, are killed, captured, or missing. September 27, X-Corps and 8th Army link up south of Seoul. The North Korean forces trapped between them cease to exist as an organized fighting force. It's one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. In August, the United Nations barely held a foothold in Korea. By late September, North Korea's army is shattered. Total victory seems within reach. And that's when the crucial question arises. Does the UN stop at the 38th parallel, or does it keep going? The original UN resolution authorized armed assistance to South Korea, meaning defending South Korea from invasion, is less than Hashon. 0 hash is greater than. That mission is accomplished. The 38th parallel could be restored as the border, North Korea pushed back to where it started. Status quo ante bellum, the situation before the war. But MacArthur wants more. Syngman Rhee demands more. Why stop now? Why not reunify Korea under a democratic government? Why not end the communist threat permanently? Britain urges caution. British officials warn about potential Chinese intervention if UN forces approach the Chinese border. They counsel restraint, take the victory, restore the parallel, declare success. But Republic of Korea forces are already preparing to cross north. Ri has zero interest in stopping at the parallel. For him, there is no South Korea and North Korea. There's just Korea, and it all belongs to him. Late September, President Truman authorizes UN forces to cross the 38th parallel. But he imposes restrictions. Only Republic of Korea forces can operate near the Chinese border. American and other UN troops must stay back. The goal is to avoid provoking China. In Beijing, Mao Zedong watches UN forces mass at the parallel and sees an existential threat. From China's perspective, a unified Korea under American protection means US military forces directly on China's border. It means American air bases within striking distance of Chinese cities. It means the loss of North Korea as a buffer state. And after the US 7th Fleet moved into the Taiwan Straits in June, blocking China from finishing its civil war, Mao is already convinced America intends to threaten China from every direction. A Chinese Communist Party document from late September captures Mao's thinking. For us, the Korean question is not simply a question concerning Korea, it is related to the Taiwan issue. From the information we got, they wanted to calm China first, and after occupying North Korea, they will come to attack China. China begins moving troops to the border. By October, roughly 225,000 soldiers of the People's Liberation Army are positioned in Manchuria, just north of the Yalu River. They're organized into army groups, supplied, and ready to cross. Mao sends a warning through diplomatic channels, via India, which maintains relations with both sides. The message is clear: China will not tolerate non-Korean forces near the Yalu River. If UN troops approach the border, China will intervene. The warning reaches Washington. It reaches Tokyo. MacArthur's intelligence chief, Major General Charles Willoughby, analyzes it and concludes, China is bluffing. They won't dare attack. The risk is too high. They're still recovering from their civil war. It's all posturing. It's one of the worst intelligence assessments in American military history. Early October, Republic of Korea forces cross the 38th parallel. October 9, 8th Army follows them north. The target, Pyongyang, North Korea's capital. MacArthur predicts the war will be over by Christmas. He's right that it'll be over by Christmas. He's just wrong about who will be winning. October 19, 1950, Pyongyang falls to 8th Army after brief resistance. The North Korean capital is in UN hands. Kim Il-sung's government flees north toward the Chinese border. The Korean People's Army continues fighting rearguard actions, but they're retreating, not defending. Meanwhile, X-Corps, still operating as a separate command under General Almond, redeploys to Korea's east coast. The plan is to land at Wonsan and drive north, creating a pincer with 8th Army in the west. But the operation gets delayed by mines in Wonsan Harbor, and by the time X-Corps lands on October 26, Republic of Korea forces have already captured the city by advancing overland. The Marines land to find Bob Hope and a USO show already performing for ROK troops on the beach. It's embarrassing, but it doesn't matter. The North is collapsing anyway. October 24, MacArthur makes a fateful decision. He lifts the restrictions on non-Korean forces operating near the Chinese border. Now, American, British, and other UN troops can advance all the way to the Yalu River. The order is controversial. It directly contradicts Truman's earlier guidance, but MacArthur justifies it as military necessity. The race to the Yalu begins. UN forces push north through October and into November. Resistance is scattered and light. Some North Korean units surrender en masse. Others melt into the countryside. The war feels over. October 25. Forward Republic of Korea units reach the Yalu River in some sectors. Soldiers dip their canteens in the river, take photos, send messages. We made it. The Chinese border is right there. Across the water, you can see Manchuria. And then the trap springs. October 25, 1950. Chinese forces attack Republic of Korea units near the town of Onjong, close to the Yalu. The ROK troops are overrun, scattered, destroyed. Survivors flee south, with stories of massive Chinese forces appearing out of nowhere. November 1 through 3, Chinese troops hit the US 8th Cavalry Regiment and ROK 2 Corps near Ansan. The attacks come at night, whistles blowing, bugles blaring, mortars falling like rain. Chinese infantry infiltrate between American positions, surround units, cut them off from support. The Chinese tactics are sophisticated and terrifying. They don't attack in one massive wave. They probe for weak points, then exploit them with small units moving fast. They use the terrain expertly, appearing from unexpected directions. And they attack at night, when American firepower and air support are least effective. An American soldier at Unsan later remembers, there was just mass hysteria on the position. It was every man for himself. The shooting was terrific. There were Chinese shouting everywhere. I didn't know which way to go. In the end, I just ran with the crowd. We just ran and ran until the bugles grew fainter. The 8th Cavalry Regiment is mauled, companies destroyed, battalions scattered. The 1st Cavalry Division's first major engagement with Chinese forces costs them 1,481 men killed, wounded, or captured. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the Chinese disengage. November 6, the attacks stop. Chinese forces melt back into the mountains. They're gone. UN forces are stunned and confused. What just happened? Who were these troops? How many are there? MacArthur's assessment is catastrophically wrong. He tells Washington that the Chinese intervention is limited, maybe 30,000 volunteers, not regular army units. They're just testing UN resolve, he says. They won't commit to full-scale war. The attacks were a political gesture, not a serious military operation. Based on this assessment, MacArthur orders a new offensive, the final push to end the war. He calls it the Home by Christmas offensive. US troops will advance to the Yalu, eliminate remaining North Korean resistance, and occupy the entire peninsula. The war will be over in weeks. American soldiers, preparing for the offensive, are optimistic. Some units plan Thanksgiving dinners, turkey, cranberry sauce, all the fixings, even in the snow. Mail from home talks about Christmas leave. The war is almost over. November 21. Advance elements of the 7th Infantry Division reach the Yalu River. They pose for photos at the riverbank, looking across at China. Officers send triumphant messages to MacArthur. Mission accomplished. November 24, Thanksgiving Day. American units across North Korea stop to eat turkey dinners flown in specially for the holiday. Morale is high. November 25, MacArthur launches his final offensive. November 26, 200,000 Chinese troops counterattack along the entire front. The soldiers expecting to be home by Christmas are about to enter a frozen hell. November 27, 1950, 1st Marine Division positions around the Chosin Reservoir. Temperature, minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. That's minus 34 Celsius for anyone counting. Cold enough that spit freezes before it hits the ground. The Chosin Reservoir sits in the mountains of northeast North Korea, a bleak landscape of frozen lakes and rocky ridges connected by a single narrow road. That road, 78 miles from the reservoir back to the coast at Hungnam, is the Marines' only lifeline. Approximately 30,000 UN troops are spread around the reservoir. The 1st Marine Division holds the western side, regiments at Udamni to the north, a supply base at Hagaru-ri in the middle, more troops at Koto-ri further south. East of the reservoir, US Army units from the 7th Infantry Division, about 3,000 men organized as Task Force Faith and Task Force McLean, hold exposed positions. The Marines don't like how spread out they are. Major General Oliver Smith, commanding the 1st Marine Division, has been moving cautiously north against General Almond's repeated demands to advance faster. Smith knows something Almond doesn't want to hear. These positions are vulnerable. Night of November 27, the Chinese attack. Not 30,000 Chinese volunteers, like MacArthur estimated. 12 divisions. 120,000 men of the 9th Army Group, People's Liberation Army, under General Song Shi-lun. They've been hiding in the mountains for weeks, moving only at night, freezing in their positions during the day, waiting for this moment. The assault begins with bugles and whistles piercing the darkness. Then mortars, hundreds of them, falling on every Marine position simultaneously. Then rifle fire, close-in grenade attacks, waves of infantry emerging from the darkness on all sides. At Udamni, 2 Marine regiments, the 5th and 7th Marines, about 8,000 men, suddenly find themselves surrounded and under attack from multiple directions. Chinese troops infiltrate between company positions, cut communication lines, attack command posts. It's chaos in the dark and cold. The cold is as much an enemy as the Chinese. M1 rifles jam because the oil in the mechanisms freezes. Machine guns stop working. Mortars malfunction. Grenades don't always detonate because the explosive compounds are too cold. Medical corpsmen discover their morphine syrettes are frozen solid. They can't give wounded Marines pain relief because the morphine won't flow. Some corpsmen start carrying the syrettes in their mouths to keep them warm. Blood plasma freezes in the bottles. Batteries die in the radios. Marines learn to urinate on their rifle bolts to thaw them for action. They wrap weapons in sleeping bags when not in use. Those who touch metal with bare skin leave patches of flesh behind. And through all this, the Chinese keep attacking. East of the reservoir, the army units designated Task Force Faith and Task Force McLean face even worse odds. They're more exposed, less concentrated, and hit just as hard. By morning of November 28, both task forces are surrounded and taking heavy casualties. Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith, the task force is named after him now, after its original commander Colonel McLean is killed, radios for help. A relief column is organized. US Army troops and British Royal Marine Commandos from 41 Commando try to fight their way through to the surrounded forces. The relief column gets ambushed. Chinese troops hit it from the high ground along the road. The British Marines take severe casualties, fighting through roadblocks. Some relief elements make it through temporarily, but they can't hold the road open. November 28, Lieutenant Colonel Faith sends a desperate message to General Armand. Unless someone can help us, I don't have much hope that anybody's going to get out of this. Faith is killed the next day, shot while leading a counterattack against Chinese positions. Task Force Faith, now leaderless and surrounded, makes the decision to break out and fight south toward Hagaruri. They load their wounded onto trucks, form a column, and start moving on the morning of December 1. What follows is a 4-mile gauntlet through hell. Chinese troops line both sides of the road, firing down from the ridges. Every 100 yards, there's a roadblock. Felled trees, disabled vehicles, Chinese machine gun positions. The column has to fight through each one. American aircraft provide close air support. F-4U Corsairs diving low, dropping napalm danger close to friendly positions, strafing Chinese troops on the hillsides. It's the only thing keeping the column moving. But the cold is destroying the task force as surely as Chinese bullets. Men are freezing to death in the truck beds. Wounded men, unable to move, simply freeze where they lie. Feet freeze inside boots. Hands freeze to weapons. By the time the survivors of Task Force Faith reach the Hagaruri perimeter, the task force has ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Of 2,500 men who started the breakout, only 385 make it to Hagaru in condition to fight. Over 2,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or so badly frostbitten, they're non-effective. It's one of the worst small unit disasters in US military history. Meanwhile, at Udamni, on the west side of the reservoir, the two Marine regiments are holding their positions but taking casualties every night. Chinese attacks come in darkness, whistles, bugles, mortars, then infantry assault. The Marines beat them back with rifles, machine guns, artillery, and close air support during the day. But every night, the Chinese come again, is less than Hashone. 5 hash is greater than. Marine humour, dark and defiant, keeps morale from breaking completely. When asked how many Chinese they're facing, one Marine allegedly replies, "About 3 divisions. They've got us surrounded, the poor bastards." It's gallows humour, but it reflects something real. The Marines refuse to see themselves as trapped. They're not surrounded. They're in a target-rich environment. December 1, General Smith makes the decision. All positions will withdraw to Hagaruri, consolidate forces, then fight south as one column to the coast at Hungnam for evacuation by sea. A reporter asks Smith if the Marines are retreating. Smith delivers the line that becomes legendary. "Gentlemen, we are not retreating. We are merely advancing in another direction." The Frozen Chosen is about to become the fighting withdrawal. December 1, 1950, the Marines at Udamni begin their withdrawal to Hagaruri. 14 miles. Every yard will be contested. This isn't a retreat in the traditional sense. Units don't simply fall back in disorder. The Marines conduct a fighting withdrawal, a deliberate tactical movement under fire that requires discipline most armies can't maintain, even in good conditions. In -30-degree cold, surrounded by a numerically superior enemy, it borders on the miraculous. The column is massive, 8,000 Marines, their equipment, their wounded, and their dead. The Marines refuse to leave anyone behind. Bodies are strapped to vehicles, frozen solid, stacked like cordwood. Every Marine comes home, alive or dead. The Chinese hold all the high ground along the road. They've set up ambush positions, roadblocks, machine gun nests on the ridges overlooking every turn. The Marines have to fight for every mile. But the Marines have one decisive advantage: air support. Every available aircraft in theatre flies missions over the withdrawal route. F-4U Corsairs and F-51 Mustangs make strafing runs, drop napalm on Chinese positions, attack anything that moves near the column. C-47 transport planes drop supplies by parachute, ammunition, medical supplies, food, batteries for the radios. The constant air cover keeps Chinese forces at a distance and breaks up attacks before they fully develop. The march takes 4 days, December 1 through 4. 4 days of continuous combat in sub-zero cold. Marines fight by day, dig in at night, then fight again the next morning. Wounded ride in trucks when there's room, walk when there isn't. Men with frozen feet keep marching because stopping means dying. December 4. The column from Udamni reaches Hagaru-ri and links up with the garrison there. Now, there are roughly 14,000 Marines and soldiers concentrated at Hagaru, but they're still 40 miles from the coast. 40 miles through Chinese forces that show no sign of giving up. At Hagaru, there's one piece of good news: the airstrip. Engineers somehow carved a runway out of the frozen ground while under fire. C-47 transport planes can land now, and they do, flying in supplies, flying out the worst wounded. Over 4,000 casualties are evacuated by air from Hagaru between December 1 and December 6. December 6, the consolidated column begins the breakout from Hagaru toward Koto-ri, 11 miles south. Again, Chinese forces contest every mile. Again, the Marines fight their way through. Then they reach Fengchilin Pass and find the bridge is gone. The Chinese demolished a critical bridge over a deep gorge in the pass. Without the bridge, the column can't proceed. The gorge is 1,500 feet deep, the walls nearly vertical. Trucks, artillery, and wounded can't climb around it. They're trapped. The solution comes from the Air Force. C-119. Flying boxcar cargo planes will paradrop bridge sections, portable steel treadway bridge components, each section weighing several tons, directly to the Marines at the gap. It's never been done before. The bridge sections are huge, the parachutes barely adequate, the drop zone tiny. Several sections are damaged on landing or drift off target. But enough sections survive the drop. December 8 and 9. Marine engineers assemble the bridge sections under fire. Chinese troops on the surrounding ridges shoot at the engineers while they work in -20-degree cold, bolting steel components together over a 1,500-foot drop. They get it done. December 9 and 10, the entire column crosses the improvised bridge at Funchilin Pass. Every vehicle, every piece of artillery, every wounded man crosses safely. The Chinese can't stop them. December 11, 1950. The column reaches Hungnam on the coast. They're out. Over the next 2 weeks, the US Navy conducts one of the largest evacuations in military history. Between December 11 and December 24, ships evacuate 105,000 UN troops from Hungnam, along with 18,400 vehicles, 350,000 tons of supplies, and 98,000 North Korean civilians who choose to flee south rather than live under communist rule. Before the last ships leave, UN forces destroy Hungnam port with demolitions and naval gunfire, denying it to the enemy. December 24, Christmas Eve, the final ships depart. The 1st Marine Division suffered approximately 4,500 battle casualties at Chosin and 7,500 non-battle casualties, mostly from frostbite. But the division survived intact, brought out its equipment, its wounded, and its dead. They survived the frozen Chosin. But the war was far from over. For 70 years, the story of Chinese tactics in Korea has been consistent. Human wave attacks. Endless hordes of Chinese soldiers charging into machine gun fire, accepting massive casualties, overwhelming UN positions through sheer numbers. It's become the accepted narrative. There's just one problem. It's not entirely accurate. Human wave attacks did happen, especially later in the war, when Chinese forces were desperately trying to break fortified UN positions. British actor Michael Caine, who served in Korea with the Royal Fusiliers, recalled one night attack that fits the stereotype perfectly. The searchlights sprang into life, and there, in front of us, a terrifying tableau was illuminated. Thousands of Chinese advancing towards our positions led by a troop of demonic trumpet players. The first wave of Chinese committed suicide by hurling themselves onto our barbed wire so their bodies could be used as a bridge for the troops following. That's a vivid, horrifying image, and Caine had no reason to lie about what he saw. But historians who've studied Chinese military documents and interviewed Chinese veterans paint a more complex picture of Chinese tactics, especially in the early phase of the war. The numbers tell part of the story. In most early engagements, Chinese forces didn't significantly outnumber UN troops at the point of attack. Sometimes they had numerical superiority, sometimes they didn't. What they had was better tactics for the terrain and conditions. Many of the Chinese troops who entered Korea in late 1950 were veterans, battle-hardened soldiers who'd fought in the Second Sino-Japanese War against Japan and then in the Chinese Civil War against the 1950 nationalists. These weren't untrained peasants being driven forward at gunpoint. They were experienced soldiers who'd already beaten one American-equipped army, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. Chinese tactics were sophisticated. First, attack almost exclusively at night. This neutralized American advantages in air support, armor, and artillery observation. UN forces couldn't use what they couldn't see. Second, use sound as a weapon. Bugles, whistles, and shouts weren't just for communication. They were psychological warfare designed to make Chinese forces seem more numerous and omnipresent than they actually were. In the darkness, with bugles sounding from multiple directions, it was impossible for UN troops to know how many enemies they faced or where they were. Third, infiltration tactics. Rather than attacking frontally, Chinese units would infiltrate between defensive positions, bypass strong points, attack from the flanks and rear, cut supply lines, and isolate units from each other. American defensive doctrine emphasized frontal defense with supporting units on the flanks. The Chinese simply went around the front and attacked the supports. Fourth, pre-battle preparation. Before attacks, Chinese units held large meetings where officers explained the tactical plan and the political significance of the battle. Every soldier understood the mission, the terrain, and his role. This produced better tactical execution than simply ordering men forward. Chinese equipment was a mixed bag, mostly captured weapons. Japanese Arisaka rifles from the war against Japan, American weapons captured from the nationalists, Soviet PPS-4, 1 submachine guns, Mosin Nagant rifles, and other imports. They lacked heavy weapons, few tanks, limited artillery, so they compensated with mortars, rockets, and grenades for close-in fighting. And Chinese soldiers were motivated. Western sources often attributed Chinese battlefield performance purely to indoctrination or coercion. The commissars will shoot you if you retreat. That played a role, but so did genuine conviction. Li Hua, a 23-year-old Chinese soldier who'd been fighting since he was 16, later explained, "We felt pretty confident because we had just beaten the Kuomintang with all their support from the Americans. We expected to do the same to Syngman Rhee's people. We weren't very wrong. They were a pushover compared with the Japanese." Meanwhile, American morale collapsed. US training emphasized frontal defense, mechanized warfare, and heavy reliance on vehicles and roads. When Chinese forces attacked from unexpected directions in terrain where vehicles couldn't go, American units felt exposed and vulnerable. A British officer observed American troops and reported back to London, "Americans feel very naked when anybody threatens their flank or rear." By the end of 1950, UN forces had been driven completely out of North Korea in the longest retreat in US military history. British Private Albert Varley summed it up. It was a proper shambles, a right cock-up. The human waves weren't waves at all. They were tactics, sophisticated, effective tactics that exploited every American weakness. And they'd driven the most powerful military on Earth 300 miles south in 6 weeks. December 1950 into January 1951, the coldest winter in Korean memory. Temperatures plunged to -20, -30 degrees across the peninsula. Rivers freeze solid. Snow covers the mountains. And through this frozen landscape, hundreds of thousands of refugees flee south ahead of advancing Chinese forces. The roads are packed with humanity, old men carrying bundles on A-frames, women with babies strapped to their backs, children barefoot in the snow, entire families pushing handcarts loaded with their remaining possessions. They walk south because staying north means living under communist rule again, and they've seen what that looks like. The Han River through Seoul freezes thick enough to walk on. This allows UN forces to withdraw across it, but it also means the river is no longer a defensive barrier. Seoul can't be held. In Washington and other UN capitals, debate rages about whether to evacuate Korea entirely. Cut losses. Get out while you can. The Chinese seem unstoppable. MacArthur's predictions of easy victory have turned into catastrophic defeat. Why keep fighting a war this far from home against an enemy that keeps coming? MacArthur has answers, escalatory answers. He requests Chinese nationalist troops from Taiwan to join UN forces in Korea. Truman says no, bringing Chiang Kai-shek's forces into the fight would guarantee full Chinese commitment and possibly Soviet intervention. MacArthur develops bombing target lists for Chinese cities across the border in Manchuria. He proposes using atomic weapons. Not just a few, enough to create a radioactive belt along the Yalu River that would make crossing impossible. A nuclear barrier that would seal off North Korea from Chinese reinforcement. Truman turns him down. The president understands what MacArthur apparently doesn't. Using nuclear weapons in Asia could trigger World War III. The Soviet Union has atomic weapons now. They have a mutual defense treaty with China. The risk is existential. But Truman doesn't pull out of Korea either. Too much prestige is at stake. American prestige, UN prestige, the entire concept of collective security against communist aggression. If the United States abandons South Korea now, what message does that send to the Soviets about American resolve in Europe? About defending Japan? About the value of American alliance commitments anywhere? So the war continues, and men keep dying in the Korean winter. Tension within the UN alliance reaches a breaking point. British officials are particularly critical of American military performance and MacArthur's leadership. British General Sir Robert Mansergh files a scathing report about US forces. The reason for this is primarily because of the American lack of determination and their inability to stand and fight. Their training is quite unsuited to that type of country or war, and, in spite of lessons learnt, they will not get clear of their vehicles. They have never studied or been taught defence. They appear only to have studied mechanized and mechanical advances at great speed. Americans feel very naked when anybody threatens their flank or rear. It's not entirely fair. American soldiers are fighting hard in brutal conditions, but there's truth in it. US doctrine and training don't match Korean reality. December 23, 1950, General Walton Walker, commander of 8th Army, dies in a jeep accident north of Seoul. His vehicle collides with a ROK Army truck. Walker is killed instantly. 8th Army loses its commander at the worst possible moment. MacArthur needs a replacement immediately. He chooses Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway, 55 years old, World War II airborne commander, veteran of Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and the Market Garden operation. Ridgway is aggressive, competent, and not afraid to challenge assumptions. Ridgway arrives in Korea and immediately sees the problems. Morale is shattered, units are roadbound, defensive positions are poorly prepared, all-round defense is non-existent. American forces have been trained to attack with overwhelming firepower, not to defend in difficult terrain against an enemy that attacks from unexpected directions. Ridgway implements new training immediately. All-round defense, dismounted infantry tactics, aggressive patrolling, night operations, fire discipline. He emphasizes that roads are not safety, they're avenues of approach for the enemy. Ridgway wants units that can fight off the roads, hold ground without vehicles, defend in all directions simultaneously. But changing an army's doctrine takes time, and time is something UN forces don't have much of. January 3, 1951, UN forces evacuate Seoul for the second time. They fall back 60 kilometers south to stronger defensive positions. The capital, captured by North Korea in June, recaptured by UN forces in September, now abandoned again in January, is left to the Chinese and North Koreans. It's the low point of the war for UN forces. Soldiers are exhausted, frostbitten, demoralized. The question isn't whether they can win anymore, it's whether they can survive. But the Chinese have problems too. Big problems. And Matthew Ridgway is about to exploit them. The Chinese offensive that drove UN forces out of North Korea and captured Seoul looks unstoppable from the outside. From the inside, it's falling apart. China's logistics system is almost entirely non-mechanized. Supplies move by porter, pack animal, bicycle, and handcart, the same methods Chinese communist forces used during their civil war. It worked in China where supply lines were short and the enemy was collapsing. In Korea, with supply lines stretching hundreds of miles through mountains and under constant air attack, it's failing. UN aircraft bomb and strafe anything moving on North Korean roads during daylight. The Chinese adapt by moving only at night, but that slows everything down. Rail lines are bombed repeatedly. Chinese work crews repair them. UN planes bomb them again. An endless cycle. Every ton of supplies that reaches the front requires 10 tons to leave the rear because so much is destroyed or consumed in transit. Food runs short. Ammunition runs short. Winter clothing, desperately needed in the Korean cold, never arrives in sufficient quantities. Medical supplies are scarce. Chinese soldiers start suffering from frostbite, malnutrition, disease. A Chinese soldier later recalls the desperation. We quickly got used to American biscuits and rice, but we never cared for tomato juice. We were particularly glad to get carbines, because we found rifles too heavy to carry. Without the American sleeping bags and overcoats we captured, I am not sure we could have gone on. 2/3 of our casualties were from the cold that winter. The Chinese army in Korea survives partly on captured American supplies, rations, weapons, clothing, equipment. When they can't capture enough, they suffer. By early 1951, the Chinese offensive has outrun its logistics. Units that pushed south to Seoul are now hundreds of miles from their supply bases in Manchuria. They're exhausted, undersupplied, and taking casualties from cold as much as combat. The numbers tell the story. In early January 1951, approximately 486,000 Chinese and North Korean troops faced 365,000 UN troops. The Communists have numerical superiority. But many Chinese units are at 50% strength or less due to casualties, frostbite, and disease. They're not capable of sustained offensive operations anymore. Ridgway senses the opportunity. In mid-January, when Chinese forces launch another offensive push south from Seoul, UN forces contain it. The Chinese don't break through. The attacks peter out after a few days. The Chinese offensive has burned out. Late January into February, Ridgway starts limited counterattacks, probing north, testing Chinese positions. He finds what he suspected. The Chinese are dug in, holding ground, but not capable of major offensive operations. They're defending now, not attacking. March 1951, Ridgway launches Operation Ripper, a methodical offensive north towards Seoul using overwhelming firepower. Artillery pounds Chinese positions. Aircraft strike constantly. Infantry advances with tank support, systematically clearing resistance. March 15, 1951, UN forces recapture Seoul for the second time. It's the fourth time the capital has changed hands in 10 months of war. The city is in ruins, buildings destroyed, infrastructure wrecked, population fled. But it's back in UN hands. Chinese and North Korean forces withdraw north toward the 38th parallel. They're not routed. They conduct fighting withdrawals, hold rearguard positions, make UN forces pay for every mile. But they're retreating. By late March, the front stabilizes roughly along the 38th parallel, where the war started 10 months earlier. The line has come full circle. Late March 1951, MacArthur looks at the stabilized front line and sees unfinished business. The war was supposed to end with Korean reunification under a democratic government. Instead, it's back where it started, and now there's talk of negotiations. MacArthur despises the idea of negotiating with communists. To him, it's weakness, accepting stalemate when victory is still possible with the right strategy and sufficient resources. He renews his calls for escalation: bomb Chinese bases in Manchuria, blockade the Chinese coast, bring in nationalist Chinese troops from Taiwan, expand the war. Washington says no. President Truman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff want to limit the war, not expand it. The goal now is to restore the 38th parallel as the border and negotiate a ceasefire. Most UN allies, especially Britain, strongly support this approach. MacArthur disagrees publicly. Early April 1951, MacArthur issues unauthorized statements to the press, criticizing the administration's limited war strategy. He argues that there's no substitute for victory, that accepting a stalemate in Korea is tantamount to surrender, that the real enemy is Communist China, and the war should be taken to Chinese territory. It's not the first time MacArthur has publicly disagreed with administration policy. But this time, he goes further. He sends a letter to Republican Congressman Joseph Martin criticizing Truman's Korea policy. Martin reads the letter on the floor of the House of Representatives, making it public. The letter includes lines that directly challenge the president: there is no substitute for victory, and suggestions that the administration's policy will lead to communist domination of Asia. It's insubordination. A theatre commander publicly undermining his commander-in-chief's policy while the nation is at war. More than that, it's a constitutional issue about civilian control of the military. Truman is furious. So are the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who worry about the precedent of a military commander making foreign policy through public statements. Even some of MacArthur's supporters admit he's crossed a line. Truman consults with his advisers. Secretary of State Dean Acheson supports firing MacArthur. So does Secretary of Defense George Marshall. The Joint Chiefs unanimously recommend relief. It's not about MacArthur's strategy. Reasonable people can disagree about whether to expand the war. It's about maintaining civilian authority over the military. April 11, 1951, President Truman relieves General Douglas MacArthur of all his commands: Supreme Commander of UN Forces in Korea, Commander of US Far East Command, Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers in Japan. Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway is promoted to replace him in all positions. The announcement shocks the world. MacArthur is a living legend. Hero of the Pacific War, the man who accepted Japan's surrender, the architect of Japan's post-war transformation, the strategist behind the Incheon landing. And now he's fired, recalled to the United States, his career over. American public reaction is mixed and intense. Many support MacArthur and see him as a hero being punished for wanting to win. Others support Truman and believe civilian control of the military is more important than any general's reputation. Truman's approval rating plummets. In South Korea, reaction is complicated. Syngman Rhee supported MacArthur's strategy. He wants reunification and total victory. But Rhee is also realistic enough to know he needs American support to survive, so he accepts the decision publicly while privately fuming. In other UN capitals, especially London, there's quiet relief. British officials feared MacArthur's escalatory strategy would lead to World War III. They're glad he's gone. MacArthur returns to the United States to a hero's welcome. He addresses a joint session of Congress on April 19, delivering his famous "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away" speech. It's emotional, eloquent, and defiant. Then, MacArthur does exactly what he said. He fades away. He retires from public life, lives quietly in New York, and never holds another position of authority. Ridgway takes full command with clear orders from Washington. Hold the line near the 38th parallel, prepare for Chinese spring offensives, and be ready for negotiations. The Chinese spring offensive is coming, and it will be the last great battle of the Mobile War. April 22, 1951, China launches its largest offensive of the war. 700,000 Chinese and North Korean troops attack along the entire front, but the main weight falls on the western sector, the most direct route to recapture Seoul. In the path of the offensive, British 29 Infantry Brigade positioned along the Imjin River about 30 miles north of Seoul. The 29 Brigade consists of 4 battalions: the Gloucestershire Regiment, the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, the Royal Ulster Rifles, and the Belgian United Nations Battalion, supported by Filipino tanks and British artillery. They're spread across a wide front, too wide for the number of troops available, defending poorly prepared hilltop positions. They're about to face overwhelming odds. Night of April 22, Chinese forces hit the British positions in strength. Not probing attacks, not limited assaults, mass attacks across the entire brigade front. Thousands of Chinese infantry, supported by mortars and artillery, attacking under cover of darkness. The Belgian battalion on the western flank gets hit first and hardest. They fight through the night, but by morning face the choice between being overrun or withdrawing. They withdraw south under heavy fire, taking significant casualties. The Royal Northumberland Fusiliers and Royal Ulster Rifles also come under intense pressure. Chinese forces infiltrate between positions, attack from multiple directions, threaten to surround isolated companies. Both battalions conduct fighting withdrawals, trading space for survival. In the centre, the Gloucestershire Regiment, about 700 men, holds Hill 235, a position that controls key approaches to the Imjin River crossings. The Gloucesters, as they're known, dig in and prepare for the worst. April 23, Brigade Commander Brigadier Thomas Brodie radios US 3rd Division headquarters to report on the situation. He uses the phrase that becomes infamous: "The position is a bit sticky." American officers hearing this don't understand the severity. In American military parlance, A bit sticky suggests a manageable problem, some difficulty, but nothing critical. In British understatement, especially in military contexts, a bit sticky means the situation is desperate. Years later, an officer explains the miscommunication. When Tom told Corps that his position was a bit sticky, they simply did not grasp that in British Army parlance, that meant critical. Major General Robert Soule, commanding US 3rd Division, orders the 29 Brigade to hold its positions. He believes they can hold. He doesn't realize how bad things actually are. By April 24, 3 of the brigade's 4 battalions are conducting fighting withdrawals south. The Gloucestershire Regiment on Hill 235 finds itself cut off. Chinese forces have infiltrated around the position and blocked the roads south. The Gloucesters are surrounded. Relief attempts are organized. Filipino tank units try to fight through to the Gloucesters. They're turned back by Chinese roadblocks and anti-tank fire. British Centurion tanks make another attempt on April 25. They get close enough to see Hill 235, but can't break through the Chinese cordon. One Centurion tank reaches a position near the Gloucesters and becomes the scene of desperate close combat. Retreating British soldiers and attacking Chinese infantry both try to climb onto the tank at the same time. The tank's machine guns fire at both groups, trying to clear attackers off the hull, hitting Chinese troops, hitting British troops, everyone fighting everyone in the chaos. By April 25, US I Corps orders a general withdrawal along the entire Western Front to establish a new defensive line south of the Imjin River. Every UN unit withdraws, except the Gloucestershire Regiment, which is still surrounded on Hill 235. British headquarters sends a message to Lieutenant Colonel James Carney, the Gloucester's commander. The decision is his. Attempt a breakout or surrender. No one else can make that choice for him. Night of April 25, Carney orders a breakout attempt. The plan is for the entire battalion to fight through the Chinese encirclement and reach UN lines to the south. It's approximately 6 miles through Chinese positions, in darkness, carrying the wounded. The breakout begins after midnight. D Company, in the best tactical position, manages to break through the Chinese lines and fight its way south. Approximately 40 men from D Company reach UN lines, exhausted, many wounded, but alive. The rest of the battalion isn't as fortunate. Chinese forces are everywhere in the darkness, blocking routes, ambushing columns, overrunning positions. Small groups of Gloucesters fight desperate actions through the night, but most are killed or captured. Morning of April 26, the surviving Gloucesters on Hill 235 are out of ammunition, out of options, surrounded by Chinese forces that now include artillery and armour. Colonel Carney orders surrender. Chinese troops capture approximately 520 officers and men of the Gloucestershire Regiment. British casualties for the entire 29 Brigade during the Battle of Imjin River total roughly 1,000 killed, wounded and captured, with the Gloucesters taking the majority of losses. British sources claim the 29 Brigade inflicted approximately 10,000 Chinese casualties during the battle, but these figures are disputed and likely exaggerated. In Britain, the Battle of Imjin River is remembered as a heroic last stand, the Gloucesters holding a critical position against overwhelming odds, buying time for UN forces to establish a new defensive line, preventing a breakthrough that could have threatened Seoul. Critics view it differently. as a wasteful sacrifice resulting from poor positioning, inadequate support, and communication failures between British and American commanders. The 29 Brigade could have defended from much stronger positions further south if they'd withdrawn earlier. But the larger strategic picture is clear. The Chinese spring offensive fails. Despite initial gains and despite the sacrifice of the Gloucestershire Regiment, Chinese forces don't break through the UN defensive lines. They don't recapture Seoul. By early May, the offensive has stalled with heavy Chinese casualties and nothing to show for it. It's the last time either side attempts a major offensive to reunify Korea by force. From this point forward, both sides settle into defensive positions, and the war transforms from mobile operations into static trench warfare. The killing continues. But now it's killing for position at the negotiating table, not killing for victory on the battlefield. July 10, 1951, peace talks begin at Kaesong, a city that changed hands multiple times during the war and now sits in no man's land. Negotiators from both sides sit down at a table to discuss ending the war. The talks make almost no progress. Both sides argue over where the ceasefire line should be drawn, whether it should follow current battle lines or revert to the 38th parallel, how prisoner exchanges should work, what guarantees exist to prevent the war from resuming. Every issue becomes a test of will. Neither side wants to appear weak by compromising first. August 10, the frustration reaches a surreal peak. Negotiators from both sides sit across the table from each other in complete silence for 2 hours and 11 minutes. Nobody speaks. Nobody moves. They just stare at each other, waiting for the other side to blink. August 22, the talks collapse entirely. Both sides walk away. The war continues. But something has changed. Neither side is trying to win anymore. They're trying not to lose. The front lines stabilize roughly along the 38th parallel. Offensive operations become limited, local affairs, company-sized attacks to take a hill, battalion-sized raids to straighten a line, but no more grand offensives aimed at Seoul or Pyongyang. On the ground, Korea is turning into World War I. In the air, it's becoming something entirely new. When the war began, UN air forces dominated with piston-engine fighters from World War II, F-51 Mustangs that flew over Normandy, Corsairs that flew over Pacific Islands, Seafires from British carriers. The small North Korean Air Force was swept from the sky in weeks. But in November 1950, everything changed. Soviet MiG-15 jet fighters appeared over North Korea. The MiG-15 is a revelation, swept wings, capable of exceeding 650 miles per hour, service ceiling above 50,000 feet, armed with one 37mm and two 23mm cannons that can shred bombers. It's superior to every early American jet in theater. The United States responds by rushing F-86 Sabres to Korea, swept-wing jets that can match the MiG's performance, especially at lower altitudes. But there aren't enough Sabres initially. The older, straight-wing F-80 Shooting Stars have to face MiGs until more Sabres arrive, and the F-82s are outclassed. The area along the Yalu River, the Chinese border, becomes known as MiG Alley. Soviet pilots fly from bases in Manchuria, patrol the river, engage UN aircraft. American pilots fly from bases in South Korea, challenge the MiGs, fight the world's first jet versus jet air battles. Both sides operate under restrictions designed to prevent the war from escalating. Soviet pilots receive orders: don't cross into South Korea, don't pursue UN aircraft beyond the Yalu, don't intercept unless attacked first. American pilots receive similar orders: don't cross into Chinese airspace, don't attack bases in Manchuria, don't start a war with China or the Soviet Union. Both sides routinely break the rules. Soviet pilots chase UN aircraft south of the Yalu. American pilots chase MiGs north across the border. Everyone pretends it's not happening. The Soviet Union never officially admits its pilots are fighting in Korea. They're all volunteers, according to Moscow, not regular Soviet Air Force. The fiction is maintained even though American intelligence knows the truth, even though some shot-down pilots are clearly Soviet, even though radio intercepts capture Russian voices. Both governments prefer the lie, because the truth means World War III. Soviet pilots face unique challenges beyond the tactical ones. They often fly with Chinese or Korean wingmen who don't speak Russian. The solution is crude. Soviet pilots write key phrases on clipboards strapped to their thighs: attack, brake left, return to base, all translated phonetically into Chinese or Korean. In actual combat, the clipboards are useless. Soviet pilots just shout commands in Russian and hope their wingmen figure it out from context and hand signals. Technologically, the MiG-15 has advantages over the early F-80 Shooting Star: higher ceiling, tighter turning radius, heavier armament. The F-86 Sabre is more competitive, especially at lower altitudes, where its hydraulic flight controls give it superior handling, is less than Hasan. Zero hash is greater than, but the most important factor isn't the aircraft, it's the pilot. American and UN pilots have a decisive advantage in training and experience. Many are World War II veterans with hundreds of combat hours. They know tactics, know how to exploit their aircraft's strengths, know how to survive. Soviet pilots are generally well trained, but less experienced. Chinese and Korean pilots are significantly less skilled. They become the easiest targets. Actual air-to-air combat is rare. Most missions involve no contact with enemy aircraft. Pilots patrol, escort bombers, fly defensive missions, never see a MiG. When combat does occur, it's sudden, violent, and often over in seconds. Speeds are too high for prolonged dogfighting. Jets scream past each other at closing speeds exceeding 1,000 miles per hour. A pilot has maybe 2 seconds to line up a shot, fire, and hope the shells connect before the target is gone. Verifying kills is nearly impossible. Combat happens at high altitude. Aircraft fall into enemy territory. Wreckage can't be inspected. Both sides claim kills they can't confirm. The numbers become propaganda. UN pilots claim 792 MiGs shot down during the war. Soviet sources claim 1,000 UN aircraft destroyed in air combat. The actual figures are probably much lower on both sides. Perhaps 350 UN aircraft lost to MiGs, perhaps 400 to 500 MiGs lost to UN fighters. Soviet sources claim most UN air victories were against Chinese or Korean-flown MiGs, not Soviet pilots. They claim Soviet pilots maintained a 2-to-1 kill ratio against American pilots. American sources dispute this vigorously. Soviet MiG pilot Captain Nikolai Vorobyov later recalled one victory. "I leveled off behind the trailing Sabre and closed in to about 100 meters. The Sabre started banking right, and I followed him. My third burst went to his right, and the fourth burst hit him when he flew into it. One 37mm cannon shell went into the tailpipe. Debris and wreckage sailed past me as the enemy plane caught fire and fell away. Whether Vorobyov's kill was confirmed, whether the Sabre pilot survived, whether this engagement even appears in American loss records, nobody knows. That's the nature of MiG Alley. Everyone claims victory, nobody can prove anything, and the war in the sky remains as murky as the war on the ground. But one thing is certain, in MiG Alley, American and Soviet pilots fought each other daily for 2 years. It was the Cold War's hottest zone, and both governments pretended it wasn't happening. While fighters duelled in MiG Alley, UN bombers tried to strangle North Korea's war effort from the air. The weapon of choice, the B-29 Superfortress, the same aircraft that firebombed Japanese cities and dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In Korea, the B-29 learns a harsh lesson. The age of the strategic bomber flying in daylight without fighter escort is over. Early in the war, B-29 seconds operate with relative impunity. North Korea has no air defense worth mentioning, and UN fighters control the skies. The bombers hit bridges, rail yards, supply depots, industrial facilities. Damage is significant. But after Chinese intervention and the appearance of MiG-15 seconds, everything changes. MiGs specifically hunt B-29 seconds. The slow, heavy bombers are perfect targets for fast jets with heavy cannons. August 1951. UN loses 5 B-29 seconds in rapid succession to MiG attacks and ground fire. The losses are unsustainable. Daylight strategic bombing effectively ends. The bombers shift to night operations, where MiGs can't find them as easily. Targets shift too, less focus on strategic targets deep in North Korea, more focus on tactical targets near the front lines, and interdiction missions against supply routes. May 1951 through March 1952, Operation Strangle. The name says it all. Strangle North Korea's logistics by bombing everything that moves supplies toward the front. UN aircraft attack rail lines, bridges, roads, tunnels, supply depots, truck convoys, anything that supports Chinese and North Korean forces. Thousands of sorties, tens of thousands of bombs, constant pressure. US Air Force intelligence produces impressive statistics. Thousands of trucks destroyed, hundreds of bridges knocked out, rail lines cut in thousands of places. The reports suggest North Korean logistics are collapsing. General Ridgway is skeptical. He looks at the intelligence reports and sees numbers that don't make sense. In one memorable message to the Air Force, Ridgway writes, "If all the enemy trucks you report as having been destroyed during the past 10 days or so were actual kills, then there would not be a truck left in all of Asia." The reality, Chinese logistics adapt. They move everything at night when aircraft can't see targets clearly. They use thousands of laborers to repair damage. A bridge bombed during the day is repaired by morning. They disperse supplies in small caches that are hard to find and hard to destroy even when found. They use pack animals, bicycles, and porters who don't show up on aerial reconnaissance photos. Operation Strangle costs UN forces 343 aircraft. The return on investment, marginal at best. Chinese supplies continue flowing to the front, slower than before but still adequate to sustain defensive operations. The broader air war produces better results for UN forces, but not in spectacular ways. Complete air superiority means UN ground forces never face air attack, a huge advantage that's easy to take for granted. Chinese and North Korean forces can't move during daylight without risk of air attack. They can't concentrate forces for major offensives without being spotted and bombed. And UN air superiority enables something genuinely revolutionary: widespread use of helicopters in combat. Helicopters appear in limited numbers at first, small H-13 Sioux Scouts that look like flying fish bowls, larger H-19 Chickasaw transports that can carry a dozen men. They're used for observation, for moving commanders quickly, for resupplying isolated positions. But the real breakthrough is medical evacuation. Helicopters fly wounded soldiers directly from frontline positions to mobile army surgical hospitals, MASH units, often within an hour of injury. The faster treatment dramatically reduces mortality rates compared to World War II. However, helicopter operations face serious limitations. They're vulnerable to ground fire. Even rifle bullets can bring down a helicopter. Weather grounds them frequently. They have limited range and payload. And there aren't enough of them. Different services compete for the limited helicopters available, and most casualties still reach aid stations by ambulance, not helicopter. The Korean War introduces helicopters to combat and proves their value. But the helicopter war everyone remembers, Vietnam, is still more than a decade away. By late 1951, Korea stops looking like 1950 and starts looking like 1917. Both sides dig in. Deep trenches snake across mountains and valleys, protected by barbed wire, minefields, bunkers, and interlocking fields of machine gun fire. Artillery pounds positions daily. Soldiers live underground in elaborately constructed bunker systems, emerging only to man fighting positions or conduct raids. It's the Western Front transplanted to Asia: mud, rats, artillery, and death in confined spaces. The reason for the static front is political, not military. Negotiations resume in October 1951 at a new location, Panmunjom, a village that will become synonymous with the Korean stalemate. Both sides agree to limit military operations while talks continue. November 1951. Commanders on both sides restrict offensive operations to platoon-sized actions and smaller. No more division-level assaults, no more attempts to break through and capture Seoul or Pyongyang. Just patrols, raids, local attacks to improve defensive positions or capture key terrain features. The war becomes a contest of attrition, fought for hills that have no names, only numbers on military maps. Chinese forces still launch night attacks, trying to dislodge UN positions or test defenses. But they struggle against improved UN tactics and firepower. UN forces establish early warning outposts in front of main defensive lines, small positions that detect attacks and fall back when overwhelmed, buying time for the main line to prepare. When Chinese attacks come, searchlights snap on, flooding the battlefield with light that destroys the cover of darkness. A UN soldier later recalls the effect, "I had never seen such brilliance in my life." When they were turned on, the battlefield was not nearly as frightening for the men. They would look for an enemy on the move and then bring devastating firepower on the unwelcome visitors. Artillery, pre-registered on likely approach routes, fires within seconds of an attack starting. Mortars drop illumination rounds that keep the battlefield lit continuously. Machine guns firing on fixed lines create kill zones that attacking infantry can't cross. Chinese forces adapt by building their own elaborate defenses. Since their trenches are vulnerable to UN air attack during daylight, they dig deeper, creating underground tunnel complexes that connect fighting positions, command posts, supply dumps, barracks, even hospitals. Some tunnel systems extend hundreds of yards, complete with electric lighting, ventilation, and multiple entrances. Camouflage becomes an art form. Bunker entrances are concealed with vegetation that's replaced daily to match the season. Supply movements happen underground or at night. Artillery pieces fire from caves that are sealed with false walls between missions. By early 1952, the numbers tell the story of the build-up. Communist forces, Chinese and North Korean combined, grow to approximately 900,000 troops, 200,000 more than UN forces. Chinese artillery strength doubles compared to 1951. Both sides are preparing for a potential offensive or a very long stalemate. Living conditions on the front line are brutal, regardless of nationality. Winter brings temperatures to -20 or below. Frostbite is epidemic. Water freezes in canteens. Soldiers sleep in shifts to prevent freezing to death. Summer brings sweltering heat that turns trenches into ovens. Disease spreads, malaria, dysentery, hepatitis, trench foot. The American rotation system creates new problems. Under the point system, soldiers rotate home after accumulating enough points based on time in combat and other factors. The intent is to maintain morale by ensuring nobody stays in combat indefinitely. The effect is to constantly drain experience from units and replace veterans with new arrivals who don't know the terrain, don't know the enemy's tactics, don't know how to survive. Chinese and North Korean forces don't rotate. Soldiers stay in their units, sometimes for years. They know every hill, every approach, every firing position. They develop unit cohesion that American units, constantly losing and gaining personnel, struggle to match. But Chinese soldiers face their own morale problems. No rotation means no end in sight, inadequate supplies, limited leave, constant danger, and for what? The war has stalemated. Nobody's winning. The fighting continues because neither side will admit defeat or accept compromise. UN commanders, worried about declining combat effectiveness, plan limited offensives to keep troops sharp and maintain initiative. Chinese commanders vigorously counter every UN operation, refusing to yield ground without exacting a price. Summer 1952, UN forces establish new outpost lines in front of main defensive positions, extending the early warning network and claiming better observation positions. Chinese forces immediately counterattack, trying to eliminate the outposts before they're fully fortified. The result is a series of vicious small unit battles for positions that have marginal tactical value but enormous symbolic importance. Neither side can afford to be seen as weak at the negotiating table, so both sides fight to the death over hilltops that barely appear on maps. Hill 266, nicknamed Old Baldy. Hill 255, called Pork Chop Hill. Outpost Harry. Heartbreak Ridge. White Horse Mountain. The names change, but the pattern doesn't. Attack, counterattack, heavy casualties, and the line barely moves. 45% of American casualties during the entire Korean War occur during this static phase, from July 1951 to July 1953. 2 years of stalemate, 2 years of dying for negotiating leverage, 2 years of trench warfare, while diplomats argue over where to draw the line. Korea has become the war nobody can win and nobody can end. Hill 266 sits northwest of Choewon in central Korea. It's not particularly high, about 800 feet, and it's not strategically vital. Artillery already covers the surrounding area from other positions. Losing Hill 266 wouldn't change the war's outcome. But it becomes symbolic, and in this war, symbols matter more than strategy. Someone nicknames it Old Baldy because artillery and fighting strip the vegetation from its slopes, leaving bare rock and mud. The name sticks. June 1952, UN forces establish an outpost on Old Baldy as part of the forward defensive system. Chinese forces attack within days. The position changes hands. UN forces counterattack and retake it. Chinese forces counterattack again. For the next 9 months, Old Baldy becomes a killing ground where both sides feed troops into battle for a hilltop nobody actually needs. The pattern repeats endlessly. One side controls the hill, the other side attacks at night with overwhelming force. Brutal close combat in trenches and bunkers. The position falls, then the counterattack comes, and the hill changes hands again. Back and forth, back and forth. March 1953, the final battle for Old Baldy. A Colombian battalion holds the position as part of UN forces. Night of March 23, Chinese forces launch a massive attack preceded by the heaviest artillery barrage Old Baldy has seen. Colombian officer Captain Alfredo Ferrero later describes the assault. Tremendously heavy artillery and mortar fire fell on Old Baldy. The earth shook as if in an earthquake, accompanied by flashing and deafening explosions all around B Company's position. The fleeting silhouettes of men, weapons, and weakened fortifications seemed ghosts within the enemy bursts. Cries of anguish and agony mingled with our own and enemy machine gun rattle. Ferrero continues, "Next to me, Corporal Ernesto González Varela fired his machine gun on an onslaught of Chinese, who came upon us when a bazooka shell hit him on the face, leaving his head tangling on his back. I thought I was living a nightmare or horror movie until new explosions on my bunker brought me back to reality. I encouraged my men, and I continued to communicate with machine guns, and gave instructions for a corporal to take out the flamethrower and prepare himself to shoot the enemy when they appeared. The Colombian battalion fights through the night but can't hold against the numbers. By morning, Chinese forces control Old Baldy. This time, UN command decides the hill isn't worth another counterattack. The Chinese can keep it. In 9 months of fighting for Old Baldy, hundreds die for a hill that matters to nobody except the men ordered to take it and the men ordered to hold it. It's the Korean War in microcosm, senseless, brutal, and impossible to explain to anyone who wasn't there. Early 1952, negotiators at Panmunjom have resolved most issues. They've agreed on where the ceasefire line should run, roughly along current battle positions. They've agreed on mechanisms to enforce the armistice. They've agreed on procedures for monitoring compliance. One issue remains: prisoners of war. The problem seems simple at first. Exchange all prisoners. Both sides get their people back, standard practice since wars began. But nothing about Korea is simple. The United Nations holds approximately 170,000 prisoners, both military personnel and civilian internees, captured from North Korean and Chinese forces. Standard procedure says all prisoners should be repatriated after the war ends. The Geneva Conventions require it. China and North Korea insist on it. But in April 1952, UN officials conduct a survey of the prisoners, asking a straightforward question: do you want to return home? The results shock everyone. Only 70,000 of the 170,000 prisoners say yes, they want to return to China or North Korea. 100,000, nearly 60%, refuse repatriation. They'd rather stay in South Korea, go to Taiwan, go anywhere except back to communist rule. For the communist governments, this is catastrophic propaganda. Imagine the headlines. Thousands of Chinese and North Korean soldiers choose capitalist imprisonment over returning home to the People's Republic. It undermines everything the Communist parties claim about popular support and the superiority of their system. China demands that all prisoners be returned regardless of their wishes. It's a matter of principle, they say. The Geneva Conventions require repatriation. Personal preference is irrelevant. The United States refuses. President Truman carries the memory of what happened after World War II. At the Yalta Conference in 1945, Allied leaders agreed to return all Soviet citizens found in Western occupation zones, including Soviet soldiers who'd been captured or surrendered to the Germans. Many of these men didn't want to return to Stalin's Soviet Union. They begged not to be sent back. Some committed suicide rather than face repatriation. The Allies sent them back anyway. Stalin treated returning prisoners as traitors. Many were executed, more were sent to the Gulag labor camps. The policy produced thousands of personal tragedies and accomplished nothing politically. Truman won't repeat that mistake. He declares that no prisoner will be forcibly repatriated against his will, even if it means prolonging the war. It's a matter of American values. You don't send men back to face firing squads or labor camps if they're asking for protection. The negotiations deadlock completely over this single issue. From mid-1952 through early 1953, talks continue sporadically but make no progress. Both sides dig in. Neither will compromise. Meanwhile, men keep dying on the front lines over a disagreement about prisoners who don't want to go home. Then the world changes. March 5, 1953. Joseph Stalin dies in Moscow after suffering a stroke. The Soviet dictator who approved Kim Il-sung's invasion, who supplied North Korea with weapons and advisors, who shaped Cold War confrontation for 8 years, is dead at age 74. Stalin's death transforms the geopolitical landscape overnight. The new Soviet leadership under Georgy Malenkov and Nikita Khrushchev wants to reduce tensions with the West, focus on internal Soviet problems, and avoid expensive foreign adventures. Korea suddenly becomes negotiable. At the same time, the United States has a new president. Dwight Eisenhower won the 1952 election partly on his reputation as the victorious supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe during World War II. He didn't campaign specifically on ending the Korean War. Korea wasn't the top issue for most voters, but everyone knows Eisenhower wants to reduce defense spending and shift American strategy toward nuclear deterrence, rather than expensive conventional forces. Eisenhower's approach to Korea is pragmatic: end the war on acceptable terms, withdraw most American ground troops, rely on South Korean forces backed by American air and naval power, and save money by threatening to use nuclear weapons if the communists ever attack again. Both sides now have reasons to compromise. But first, they need to demonstrate strength, to show that ending the war is a choice, not a necessity forced by weakness. The spring of 1953 will be very bloody. January 1953, the United States Army conducts a test at the Nevada test site. A 280mm atomic cannon, nicknamed Atomic Annie, fires a 15-kiloton nuclear artillery shell downrange. The shell detonates with a flash visible for miles, a mushroom cloud rising over the desert, and a clear message. The United States now has tactical nuclear weapons small enough to use on a battlefield. Word of the test is deliberately leaked to China through diplomatic channels via India, which maintains relations with both sides. The message is unmistakable. America can use nuclear weapons in Korea without resorting to strategic bombers or ICBMs. Artillery can deliver atomic firepower directly to the front lines. The intent is intimidation. Make China believe that continuing the war risks nuclear escalation, that the price of holding out on prisoner repatriation might be mushroom clouds over Chinese troop concentrations. Whether China is actually intimidated is unclear. Publicly, Chinese officials dismiss the threat as American bluster. Privately, they're probably more concerned, but not enough to immediately change their position on prisoners. May 1953, the US Joint Chiefs of Staff present President Eisenhower with detailed plans for using nuclear weapons in Korea if negotiations fail. The plans include target lists, Chinese troop concentrations, supply depots, rail yards in North Korea, and potentially in Manchuria across the border. The military is prepared to use atomic weapons if ordered. How seriously Eisenhower considered the nuclear option remains debated by historians. He never explicitly ordered nuclear strikes, but he allowed his generals to plan for them and made sure those plans were known to the communist side through intelligence leaks. Was it a genuine threat or an elaborate bluff? Nobody knows for certain. While diplomats maneuver and nuclear threats hang in the background, the fighting intensifies. March through April 1953, Chinese forces launch their final major attacks against UN positions. The assaults focus on Republic of Korea army units, which China sees as weaker than American forces. Some ROK positions are overrun, others hold. UN forces rush reinforcements and artillery support to stabilize the line. The most intense fighting develops around a position called Pork Chop Hill, Hill 255 on military maps, another meaningless piece of terrain that becomes a symbol because neither side can afford to lose face by abandoning it. American and Chinese forces fight for Pork Chop Hill through April and into July, with the same brutal pattern as Old Baldy. Attack, counterattack, artillery, close combat, massive casualties for minimal territorial gain. Simultaneously, UN forces escalate the air campaign against North Korea is less than Hashon. Zero hash is greater than May 1953. American aircraft bomb major dams near Pyongyang and along the Chongchon River. The dams provide irrigation for rice fields and hydroelectric power for industry. Destroying them floods farmland, disrupts food production, and knocks out electrical generation. The bombing achieves its purpose, demonstrating that the United States can destroy North Korea's infrastructure systematically if the war continues. But it also produces massive civilian suffering through lost crops and destroyed homes in flooded areas. By June, the fighting begins to taper off. Both sides have made their point militarily. The nuclear threats have been delivered. Stalin's death has opened diplomatic space for compromise. Economic pressures. China wants to demobilize expensive military forces and focus on internal development to push toward resolution. Negotiators at Panmunjom sense the shift and accelerate discussions. By late June 1953, an armistice agreement is taking shape. The question now is whether Syngman Rhee will allow it to happen. June 1953. The armistice is almost complete. Both sides have agreed to terms. The ceasefire line will follow current battle positions. A 4-kilometer-wide demilitarized zone will separate the two Koreas. Prisoners who refuse repatriation will be handled by a neutral commission that will give each prisoner a chance to hear arguments from both sides before making a final choice. There's just one problem: Syngman Rhee. The South Korean president has never accepted the idea of ending the war without reunifying Korea under his government. He's fought for Korean independence for decades, first against Japan, then against communism, and he sees compromise as betrayal. An armistice that leaves Korea divided means everything he fought for remains incomplete. Rhee threatens to withdraw South Korean forces from UN command and continue fighting alone if an armistice is signed. American officials know he's probably bluffing. South Korea can't survive without American support, but they can't be certain. And even if Rhee doesn't fight on alone, he could sabotage the armistice in ways that restart the war. June 18, 1953, Rhee makes good on one threat. Without consulting the United States, he orders South Korean guards at POW camps to open the gates and release approximately 25,000 North Korean prisoners who had refused repatriation. The prisoners scatter into South Korean society, making it impossible to return them even if anyone wanted to. The communist side is furious. They accuse the United States of orchestrating the release, of sabotaging the prisoner exchange agreement, of negotiating in bad faith. The talks nearly collapse again. American officials scramble to repair the damage. They convince the communists that Rhee acted unilaterally, that the United States didn't approve and is working to prevent further incidents. They also work on Rhee using a combination of threats, will cut off aid, and promises, will sign a mutual defense treaty guaranteeing American protection for South Korea after the war. Rhee finally agrees not to obstruct the armistice, but he refuses to sign it. He won't put his name on a document that divides Korea, that accepts communist control of the North, that abandons reunification. The armistice will be signed by 3 parties, the United Nations Command, North Korea, and China, but not by South Korea. Technically, South Korea and North Korea remain at war even after the armistice because Rhee never accepts it. July 27, 1953, 10 a.m. at Panmunjom. The signing ceremony is deliberately designed so that no side appears to be the victor or the vanquished. No handshakes. No photographs of the delegations together. No speeches. Officials from each side enter the building separately, sign the documents at different times, then leave without acknowledging each other. Lieutenant General William Harrison signs for the United Nations Command. North Korean General Nam Il signs for the Korean People's Army and the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. The entire ceremony takes 12 minutes. The ceasefire takes effect at 10 p.m., 12 hours later, giving both sides time to inform all units along the 450-mile front that the shooting must stop. 10 p.m., July 27, 1953, after 3 years, 1 month, and 2 days of war, the guns fall silent. The quiet is startling. Soldiers who've lived with constant artillery fire, machine gun fire, mortar fire, aircraft overhead, explosions in the distance, suddenly hear nothing but wind and their own heartbeats. Then soldiers from both sides emerge cautiously from their trenches and bunkers. They stand on parapets, looking across no man's land at enemy positions they've been trying to kill for months or years. Lieutenant Chris Snyder of the Canadian 25 Brigade later recalls, "The Chinese all came out. My God, there were thousands of them, more than I ever thought possible, on every hill, standing, gazing at us. Some of our people thought they must have been brought forward specially to impress us." The Chinese stand in formation, watching the UN lines. The UN troops stand watching the Chinese. Nobody fires. Nobody moves forward. They just look at each other, seeing for the first time in daylight the men they've been fighting in darkness. The Korean War is over. Except it isn't. It's just paused. 5 million. That's the number historians estimate for total deaths during the Korean War, military and civilian, communist and UN, Korean and foreign. 5 million human beings who were alive in June 1950 and dead by July 1953. The South Korean military suffers approximately 613,000 casualties, of which 138,000 are killed. For a nation of 20 million people, it's catastrophic, an entire generation decimated. American forces lose 36,914 killed in action. Another 92,000 wounded. 7,600 missing. Nearly 8,000 become prisoners of war, though most eventually return home. The United States accounts for 90% of non-Korean UN casualties, a reflection of how heavily American forces carried the burden of the war. Other UN contributors pay their share in blood. Britain loses just over 1,000 killed. Canada loses 516. Turkey loses 721, the third highest among UN nations after the United States and Britain. Australia, France, Colombia, Ethiopia, the Philippines, and others. Each loses hundreds of soldiers fighting in a war that wasn't their own, on a peninsula most had never heard of before 1950. Chinese and North Korean casualties are harder to verify and remain disputed. Initial American estimates claimed 1.5 million Chinese and North Korean military deaths. These figures are almost certainly exaggerated, based partly on inflated battlefield reports and partly on propaganda purposes. More realistic estimates place communist military deaths closer to 500,000, perhaps 400,000 Chinese and 100,000 North Korean, though the split is uncertain. Add wounded and missing, and total communist military casualties probably exceed 1 million. But the real tragedy is civilian deaths. At least 1 million South Korean civilians killed, wounded, or missing. At least 1.5 million North Korean civilians killed, wounded, or missing. The actual numbers may be significantly higher. Many deaths were never recorded. Entire villages disappeared. Families were wiped out, with no one left to report them missing. Every historian who studies the Korean War agrees on one grim fact: civilian deaths outnumber military deaths, possibly by a factor of 2 to 1. This is what happens when armies fight back and forth across the same ground for 3 years, when cities change hands multiple times, when air forces bomb infrastructure and supply lines that run through civilian areas. For 3 years of war, for 5 million dead, for a peninsula in ruins, the result is a return to almost exactly where the war started. The line is still there, just a few miles north or south of where it was in June 1950. 5 million dead to move a line on a map by 50 miles. 70 years later, ask anyone who fought in Korea who won the war, and you'll get a different answer depending on who you ask. Everyone claims victory. Nobody admits defeat. And somehow, all of them have a point. South Korea and the United Nations say they won. Their argument: North Korea invaded, we stopped them, we prevented the forcible reunification of Korea under communist rule. The original mission was to defend South Korea from aggression. Mission accomplished. South Korea survives as an independent nation. That's victory. They also point to territorial gains. South Korea ends the war controlling slightly more territory than it held in June 1950, including the strategically important areas near the 38th parallel. North Korea, conversely, loses some territory, including the ancient capital of Kaesong, which ends up south of the final ceasefire line. South Korean historians make another argument about victory. 1.26 million North Korean civilians and soldiers fled or defected to the south during the war. They chose freedom over communism when given the chance. That's a victory in the competition of systems and legitimacy, they say, a referendum on which Korea people actually wanted to live in. North Korea and China also claim victory. Their argument: the goal was never to conquer South Korea. The goal was to preserve North Korea as a buffer state against American imperialism. When UN forces crossed the 38th parallel in October 1950 and drove toward the Chinese border, Chinese intervention pushed them back and saved North Korea from destruction. Mission accomplished. North Korea survives. That's victory. Chinese historians emphasize what the intervention achieved for China. It established China as a great power willing to challenge the United States. It cemented the alliance with the Soviet Union, at least temporarily. It provided combat experience that helped modernize the People's Liberation Army, including exposure to tanks, artillery, and air warfare that China lacked before Korea. China also argues it achieved strategic goals beyond Korea. Chinese forces continued supporting Ho Chi Minh's communist forces, fighting the French in Indochina throughout the Korean War. In 1953, China sent captured American artillery to the Viet Minh, weapons that proved decisive at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, where French forces were surrounded and defeated, leading to French withdrawal from Indochina. When France called for direct American military intervention to save their position, President Eisenhower refused. He feared Chinese intervention in Indochina, just as China had intervened in Korea. Korea had taught America the limits of conventional military power against Chinese forces willing to accept massive casualties. That lesson shaped American caution in Southeast Asia for the next decade. Some argue the Soviet Union gained the most from the Korean War. The Soviets supported Kim Il-sung's invasion from a distance, providing weapons, advisors, and political backing, but avoided direct involvement, except for fighter pilots in MiG Alley who officially didn't exist. The investment was relatively low, the risk was manageable, and the outcome preserved a communist ally while demonstrating Soviet commitment to supporting Allied regimes. Soviet confidence remained intact after Korea, possibly even strengthened. In 1953, Soviet forces crushed an uprising in East Germany. In 1956, Soviet tanks rolled into Hungary to suppress another rebellion. The message was clear. The Soviet Union would use force to maintain its sphere of influence, and the West wouldn't intervene militarily to stop them. Others point to an unexpected victor, Taiwan. When North Korea invaded South Korea, President Truman immediately sent the 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Straits to prevent Communist China from invading Taiwan and finishing the Chinese Civil War. That intervention, a direct result of the Korean War, saved Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government from almost certain destruction. Even after the 7th Fleet eventually withdrew, China never invaded Taiwan. Partly, this was due to the difficulty of amphibious assault across the strait. But it was also due to fear of American intervention. Korea had shown that America would intervene to stop communist expansion in Asia, and Mao couldn't risk a war with the United States over Taiwan after the costs China paid in Korea. Taiwan survives, eventually thrives, becomes one of Asia's economic powerhouses, all because the Korean War distracted and deterred Communist China at the critical moment. Then there are the minor victors, countries that contributed relatively small forces to Korea but gained disproportionate benefits. Turkey, Greece, Thailand, and the Philippines sent troops to Korea and earned gratitude from the major Western powers that translated into security guarantees. Turkey and Greece joined NATO in 1952, partly as reward for their Korean War contributions. The United States created SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, in 1955, attempting to build an Asian equivalent of NATO with the Philippines and Thailand as founding members. SEATO ultimately failed, but the attempt reflected how Korea demonstrated the value of alliance commitments. So, who actually won? The honest answer? Nobody, really. Or everybody, depending on how you define victory. 5 million people died to move a line on a map by a few dozen miles. Both Koreas survived, both claimed victory, both remained dissatisfied with the outcome. The great powers fought to a draw, accepted a stalemate neither wanted, and went home claiming success to domestic audiences while privately acknowledging the war accomplished little, except preventing the other side from winning. The debates about who won Korea remain mostly academic. What matters more is what the war changed. And the answer to that question is everything. Korea was the first test of the Cold War, the first time the Communist bloc and the Western alliance fought each other directly, the first time nuclear weapons cast their shadow over an active battlefield, the first time the United Nations attempted collective security with military force. It set the template for every Cold War conflict that followed. The concept of limited war, fighting with restricted goals, restricted geography, restricted means, always holding back from total war because of the nuclear threat, becomes the new normal. Superpowers can't fight each other directly without risking nuclear annihilation, so they fight proxy wars through allies and client states. Korea establishes the pattern that repeats in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Angola, Central America, and dozens of other conflicts over the next 4 decades. Korea proves that China is a power that must be taken seriously. Before Korea, many Western strategists dismissed the People's Liberation Army as a ragtag peasant force that couldn't stand against modern Western militaries. After Korea, nobody makes that mistake again. China has proven it can fight the United States to a stalemate, that it's willing to accept enormous casualties to achieve strategic goals, that it won't be intimidated by nuclear threats. The Chinese intervention in Korea fundamentally reshapes Asian geopolitics for generations. It makes America cautious about ground wars in Asia, a caution that influences decisions about Vietnam, influences American reluctance to intervene in Cambodia and Laos, influences calculations about Taiwan and every other Asian flashpoint. And Korea remains Korea. Still divided, still technically at war, still dangerous. The demilitarized zone created in 1953 is one of the most heavily militarized borders on Earth. Land mines by the millions. Artillery pointed in both directions. Soldiers staring at each other across a line that was supposed to be temporary 70 years ago. Families remained separated. Millions of Koreans have relatives on the other side of the DMZ they haven't seen since 1953, may never see again before they die. Periodic reunions allow a few dozen elderly Koreans to meet family members for a few hours. Tears, embraces, photographs, then goodbye again, probably forever. North Korea develops nuclear weapons and justifies them by pointing to Korea's history. America nearly used atomic bombs against us once, we'll make sure it never happens again. The nuclear program creates periodic crises, threats of preemptive strikes, sanctions, negotiations, failures, more crises. The Korean War that ended in 1953 casts a shadow over every North Korean nuclear test, every missile launch, every threat and counter-threat. South Korea transforms from the devastation of 1953 into one of the world's richest nations, an economic miracle built on American aid, authoritarian development policies, and eventually democracy. From ruins and poverty to Samsung, Hyundai, K-pop, and global cultural influence. The miracle on the Han River happens because South Korea survived the war, barely, and chose development over continued conflict. The United States maintained significant military presence in South Korea 70 years later, approximately 28,500 troops as of 2024, bases throughout the country, joint military exercises, a mutual defense treaty that commits America to defend South Korea if attacked. Korea shapes American military posture in Asia, influences decisions about Japan, Taiwan, and regional security, and keeps tens of thousands of American service members deployed far from home in a war that supposedly ended in 1953. Why is Korea called the Forgotten War? Because it sits between World War II's clear victory and Vietnam's traumatic defeat. Because it ended inconclusively, with no surrender ceremony, no victory parades, no clear narrative of triumph or tragedy. Because the outcome was ambiguous, the costs were high, and Americans preferred to move on rather than examine what happened. But the consequences of the Forgotten War are impossible to forget. North Korea's nuclear weapons threaten the world today. American troops still guard the DMZ. China and America still maneuver around the status of Taiwan, influenced by lessons from Korea. The Cold War ended in 1991, but the hot war that began in Korea in June 1950 never technically ended at all. It just paused. And 70 years later, both sides are still watching, still waiting, still wondering if the pause will hold. Remember James Ransone? The 22-year-old Marine from our opening, hearing Chinese bugles in the darkness at -30 degrees, thinking World War II was over. Ransone survived Chosin. He made it to Hungnam, evacuated by ship, went home to a country that had already moved on to other concerns. He carried frostbite scars for the rest of his life, lost 3 toes, permanent nerve damage in his hands. But he was one of the lucky ones. He came home. 59 years later, Ransone was interviewed about his experience. The interviewer asked if Americans remember the Korean War. Ransone laughed, bitter, knowing. "Nobody remembers," he said. "We were already forgotten before we got home." For the men who fought there, Korea was never forgotten. British veterans of Imjin River still gather annually to remember the Gloucesters who never came home. Turkish veterans proudly wear their Korean War medals, tell their grandchildren about fighting communism on the other side of the world. Ethiopian, Colombian, Filipino soldiers who served in Korea carry those memories until they die. American veterans came home to a country that didn't quite know what to make of them. Not heroes like World War II veterans. Not villains like Vietnam veterans would become. Just men who fought in a war that didn't seem to accomplish anything, that nobody wanted to talk about, that disappeared from national consciousness even while it was still being fought. Chinese soldiers returned to a hero's welcome. They'd stood up to American imperialism, preserved North Korea, proven China's strength. But privately, many questioned the cost. Was it worth 400,000 dead to save Kim Il-sung's regime? Worth the decades of continued tension? Worth the risk of nuclear war? These questions couldn't be asked publicly, but they were asked. Korean families on both sides carry the deepest scars. 10 million Koreans were separated from family members during the war. Most never reunited. Parents died without seeing their children. Children grew old without knowing if their parents survived. Siblings lived entire lives wondering about brothers and sisters on the other side of the DMZ. The war that never ended technically means families that never reunited permanently. The armistice that was supposed to be temporary has lasted 70 years and shows no signs of ending. This is why History Radio told you this story. 3 hours, 20,000 words, the complete account from June 1950 to July 1953. Wars without clear victory are the hardest to remember. But their consequences echo the longest. The line drawn at the 38th parallel in August 1945 was supposed to disappear in 6 months. 79 years later, it's still there. Still dividing a nation. Still defended by mines and artillery. Still keeping families apart. 5 million people died for that line. They deserve to be remembered. The soldiers who fought there, American, British, Turkish, Ethiopian, South Korean, North Korean, Chinese, and 22 nations worth of others, they deserve to be remembered. The civilians who died in crossfire, in bombings, in massacres, in the chaos of a peninsula at war, they deserve to be remembered. This has been History Radio, The Forgotten War, Korea 1950 to 53. Thank you for listening. And thank you for remembering.